Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thanks so much for joining me for today's devotional. Today's devotional is called Get the Big Rocks Out First. Now, conventional wisdom says this. There's a story that's been told in business books and it's been around for a little while. A guy by the name of Stephen Covey, he really popularized this story, but it wasn't his originally. And so a guy by the name of Charles Hummel, he actually tells a story. It's a story about a professor who in his class, he has a large glass jar, and so he asks the class, he says, is the jar full? And they look and they say, no, it's not full, it's empty. So he takes several large-sized rocks and he puts them down into this wide-mouth gallon glass jar, and he says to them, is the jar full? And they say, yeah, sure, it's full, it's filled with those large-sized little, like river rocks. And then he takes out a bucket of gravel and dumps that in there, and it sifts its way all around those rocks, and he says, is it full? And they say, no, we think that there's more to this. So he says, you're right, it's not full. He takes some sand and pours that in, and then eventually he takes a quart of water and pours that in, fills it up to the brim, to the tippity top, and then he says, now is it full? And they say, yes, it's full. And he asks them and says, what's the moral of the story here? One of the students raised their hand. They say, you can always fit more into your schedule and more into your life. And he said, no, you're missing the point. He says that you got to get the big rocks in first, otherwise you won't be able to get them in later because your life fills up with this stuff. The irony is, in this story, Jesus takes that concept and turns it on its head, and we find this, that if we don't get the rocks out of our life first, we will never be healthy. We'll never find ourselves being healthy to allow God's roots to run deep into our lives. And so we're going to actually, in a later devotional, we're going to talk about getting the big rocks in and kind of flip it again. But for this thought for today, it's all about following through on what we've promised to do. James 1:22 says this, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, but do what it says. You ever find yourself in a conversation with a friend who's a really big talker? They talk a big game, but then they sometimes don't follow through. We've all been guilty of that. I'm guilty of that. We've got a phrase around our house, do it first, then talk about it. And so for us, many times we find ourselves that we can get to a point where we like talking about things, but when it really comes down to it and the pressures come, we need to ask God to help us to have commitment to follow through. In Luke chapter 10, verse 25 to 37, Jesus talks about a story. He says, you need to count the cost. He talks about a king and a contractor. He says that a king, before he goes to war, is going to count the cost to see if he has enough men, enough soldiers to fight the battle. For a contractor, before he builds a building, he's going to count the literal cost of building materials. And right now, building materials are pretty expensive, but he's going to count the cost so that he doesn't start building the building and get halfway done, and people say, look, he started building, look how foolish it is that he didn't finish and follow through on what he's building. And so for us, we've got to find those things that are keeping us back from growing. Maybe there's some mentalities, some mindsets. Maybe there are some things that you find in your life that are keeping you back from taking a step of faith to trust God, to push through the pressures and to follow through on what you've committed to do. Here are 3 questions to ask yourself today when it comes to fearing for following through. Number 1 is this: what am I avoiding? What commitment or what decision, what action, what choice are you avoiding because of whatever your fear might be? What are you putting off? Number 2 is this: what are you assuming? What are you assuming will happen once you make that decision? Are you assuming that you're not competent enough, or that people will reject you? Are you assuming that it's too hard? Are you assuming whatever it might be? Fill in the blank there for that question. And number 3, the third question is, what am I afraid of? This question, especially this third question, whatever you identify what you're afraid of is the exact thing you need to take a step forward and do. When it comes to our commitments and following through, we've got to get those mindsets out first, out of our minds, of what we're assuming, what we're avoiding, and what we're afraid of, so that we can go ahead and commit to and follow through on what God has called us to do and find our lives being fruitful for Jesus. Thanks so much for watching the devotional today. We'll catch you in the next one tomorrow as we talk about how God can work in and through our lives with the next best right thing. Thanks for watching.